Welcome to Straight from the US, the first English program of Widoobiz, the French media for entrepreneurs. I'm Aurelien Cottet. And today I have the great pleasure to host someone who can be considered as the American version of Loïc Lemeur, our famous French blogger who lives in the Silicon Valley and who is the co-founder of Le Web that took place this past December in Paris. Welcome to Liam Boogar, who is one of the co-founders of Rude Baguette, the blog in English about French startups. Liam, before asking you how an American started such a great resource about French startups in English, tell us more about your background, who you are, what was your experience in the US, when did you become such a great writer, and most important, why are you talking about startups today?
Well, thank you very much, Aurelien, for having me here. It's really great to join you guys on your inaugural emission of the show. That's a lot of questions. I grew up in a city called Menlo Park, California. My parents moved out to the Silicon Valley in the 80s, and I grew up there while they were working in tech companies. And I was always exposed to startups. There was never an option other than working for startup companies. When I finished college, the first thing my mom said to me is, "Come back and work for Twitter," which was in 2010. So you can understand that was for my mom the safe bet. The safe bet was going and working for a private social network that at the time had no business model, or no foreseeable business model. So I grew up in the Silicon Valley, and there isn't much to say about that other than I was surrounded by technology. I did a computers class when I was 10 where we were doing HTML code. And that's a pretty amazing experience to grow up in. And when I finished college, I actually studied mathematics and Latin and ancient Greek in college. And when I finished, I really wanted to do something outside of California. I'd been there for 21 years. And so I followed a girl to France because French women are probably the best export and import resource for France. And so I came out and followed her. And when I decided to figure out what I wanted to do, I knew I was going to work in startups. There was no option. I wasn't going to go work for Orange or Capgemini. What did they want with an American in France? But I knew that a startup probably would be interested in having a native Anglophone who spoke a little bit of French, helping them out. So I went and worked for a startup, and I was doing everything Anglophone. I was doing content, communications, biz dev. At one point, my shift was I would work from noon until midnight because most of my work was calling people in the U.S. So you have to do a décalage d'heure.
Yeah.
You have to be awake when they're awake and when they're on the clock. And my job was just whatever they needed to do to look like an English U.S. startup, I would help them out with. And during that time, I started reading a lot of blogs. I watched the company raise $3 million in funding, do the big launch, TechCrunch, GigaOM, the Next Web. And so naturally, I started reading all these publications more than I did before. I believe I was familiar with TechCrunch while I was in college, but it was sort of something you looked at from a distance.
Far away.
And as I read them, one day I read an article on one of them that said, if you want to start a company, you have to have a blog. And the idea was, if you want to have an audience who's going to use your product the day you launch it, the best way to bring that audience together is to write about the topic that you're building the product in. So if you're working in social media analytics, write about social media and write about the problems, the pitfalls, the advantages, the changes that are going on, because you'll naturally bring together an audience of potential customers. So the next day I opened a blog, and I started writing about the Paris scene because I was in Paris. I started writing about tech because I was in tech, and I wrote in English because I'm Anglophone, and my French is okay. It's passable, spoken, but written, I cannot get the accents right. I do all the conjugate. It's terrible.
Me neither.
Yeah.
As a French,
Yeah.
native French.
From what I understand now, no one gets it right, except for the people who are correcting journalists at La Libération, whoever's in the background. Someone knows it right, and they're getting paid a lot of money to make sure that journalists look like they do too. And so I started blogging, and all of a sudden people started telling me that they loved the company I was building, and I kept saying, no, it's just a side project. We were just two people working on it at the time, and we were just doing one article a day. So there was two of us, so one would do an article Monday, Wednesday, Friday, one would do an article Tuesday, Thursday, and then we'd switch the next week. And I was trying to figure out what my next startup would be, and finally, after about 6 months, I actually got an interview with Deezer to work with them before they had raised this big round of funding that they announced last year. And they offered me the job, and I said, I really probably should take this job. And in retrospect, I really probably should have taken that job. I would have loved pre-100 million euro fundraising stock options. But I felt like there was something to be done, and I felt like there was a huge opportunity to write about non-Anglophone markets in English. And we had really touched on something. Since the day we launched, more than half of our audience has been outside of France, but we still have a local reach. And so we've always said, one of our core values has always been local network, international reach. People in Paris read us, people in Nantes read us, people in Bordeaux, Lyon, Lille read us, and we go out there. But we've always focused on making sure that people outside of France knew what was going on in France.
Especially because, French are pretty known to not being very good at English.
Well, that was the irony. When I first started working in a startup, I kind of assumed that I would get to learn French really quickly. But everyone wanted to practice English with me.
I do understand the point.
And I had to learn how to say the phrase in French. I bought the plane ticket, so I get to choose the language. And that was the only way that I actually learned how to speak French, is I would tell them, if you want to learn English, buy the plane ticket to San Francisco, and you can do it all you want. But I noticed that they were all reading about France in French. French Web, Journal du Net, Widoobiz had just launched when I first started. I remember it was still a young publication. But when it came to reading about the Silicon Valley, naturally, given the option to read from TechCrunch or Journal du Net about something happening in California, you're just going to choose TechCrunch because you have a feeling that they have a closer connection to what's going on. And so you saw that just on I think we were using Yammer because Yammer was still popular. On Yammer, you would see Journal du Net, French Web, all the fundraising, and then you'd see TechCrunch, GigaOM, Mashable coming by. And I realized that whether they spoke it or not, whether they were shy or not, all French people read in English, especially developers, because all developer documentation is in English.
It's in English, you're right.
And their English is phenomenal. They're shy about it, and they're introverts, just like developers everywhere else, for the most part. But they're very good at English. And we realized there was a huge opportunity to write to these people, the people who were in France and read English, and the people who were outside of France and had no idea what was going on. I think I answered most of your questions.
Yes, definitely. In fact, you answered some question I had in mind, but it doesn't matter. As you said, you come from the Silicon Valley and you came in France and you start writing about the startup on the French scene. I just wonder, what is the main difference, the comparison you can make between the French startups here in France, mainly in Paris, compared to the Silicon Valley?
I couldn't pretend to know as much about the Silicon Valley as I know about France today. That's the nature of our publication, is we focus a lot on France.
Yeah, you're right.
But I have been out there a couple times since launching the Rude Baguette. And one thing I noticed, I went to Launch Conference, which is a conference run by Jason Calacanis, who started the Silicon Valley Insider and is now a serial entrepreneur and investor. And a very well-known thought leader. He has a great blog that he runs at launch.co. And he runs the Launch Ticker. Anyway, I went to his conference last March in 2012. I actually went out with a French startup called Contract Live, and we went out together and we were looking at the U.S. market together. And I noticed that the U.S. startups are just as shitty and just as great as the French startups. And that was one of the things that blew my mind, is it's not the average startup is bad, let's be honest. I mean, the filter ratio from someone who decides they want to start a company to someone who raises money, you lose more than 50% of the company. Someone who actually manages to raise just a seed round. So that means that on average, those beginning startups, especially at a launch conference, more than half of them are bad by the definition of will not succeed and will not raise money and will not succeed as a venture.
Interesting.
And I realized that they were just as bad, just as good. They were great ones. They were fantastic ones. And I still remember them, and I've watched them grow for the past year and a half, just like I have in France. But there's no real difference other than storytelling. And this is the amazing thing. Americans are great at storytelling. And I explain that as the following. I was explaining it this week. In their business lives, Americans are all about business. And in their personal lives, Americans are all about business. And in France, in their personal lives, they're all about personal. And in their business lives, it's very personal.
That's a very interesting
And so there's this interesting overlap where I love living with French people, and I like working with Americans or French people that understand how American business works. And it's a very interesting balance to find it. And the right way to do things is somewhere in the middle. There there are a lot of strengths and weaknesses to both cultural aspects. But what that comes down to is Americans are really good at storytelling. They can take a worse product and sell it better than their French counterpart. That being said, more often than not, it is the French counterpart that has the better technology.
That's good. That's good to know. It's true that innovation is pretty amazing in France. I mean, we have developers that are exporting themselves in the US. I mean, I found a lot of my friend engineer in who was with me in France in my engineering school, who are now at the Silicon Valley. So it's I'm not surprised about that. Speaking about, so you know pretty well about the startup scene in France. What I would like to know is, outside Paris, which city for you has the most active startups?
In terms of what we write about, it'd probably be Nantes.
Nantes?
Yeah, Nantes has really come up. Companies like Lengo, iAdvise, Clever Cloud, and even the Web Today conference is a good example where I would argue that it is probably one of the best conferences that happens outside of Paris.
Okay.
And they're even working today, and we're even talking with them about bringing more of an Anglophone touch to it, because right now it's about 95% Francophone and 5% Anglophone, and we're trying to switch those numbers around, or at least get closer to the middle. But I think in terms of pure what we write about and where those companies are based, I think Nantes is doing surprisingly well. I say surprising because it's not the biggest city, and if you go by GDP, it's not where it lines up. But I don't think GDP or population size is something that that really measures it.
I would have thought more about Lyon, or I know that in Lille they do a lot of things. But that's very interesting to know that Nantes is the next Silicon Valley for France.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't think there is a Silicon Valley of France. I don't think Paris is the Silicon Valley of France. I think Paris is its own entity that is doing a lot of great things. Even earlier this week at Le Web, or even last week, I guess now, they had the Fleur Pellerin, the Minister of PME and other digital economy, who was saying that there is no intention to build a Silicon Valley in France. And I don't know if her point was the same as mine, but if you go to the Silicon Valley, you'll realize that it's impossible just by looking at the billboard advertisements in the Silicon Valley. So a billboard advertisement is the least targeted. It targets anyone with eyeballs who passes by that location.
Yes.
And in the Silicon Valley, they advertise Box is hiring, Dreamforce is coming, check out this new, Candy Crush advertising.
Yeah.
It tells you just how dense technology is in that area. And if you think about it here, I mean, technology is great in Paris, but so is fashion. Especially the district we're in right now. We're in the old, sewing and textile district.
Definitely.
And there's so many things going on in Paris that you'll never have this dense population. That doesn't mean that you won't have a Criteo, which we already do, or
you never know.
Large companies like Airbnb that have more than twice the listings in Paris as they do in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And arguably, now that New York is looking rocky for them, Paris will become their most profitable city from a financial perspective.
Interesting to know. So we have a few minutes left. I have two parts. One last question is I'm dying to ask you. You spoke about startups and you spoke about blog. And I'm dying to know what is your economical business model for Rude Baguette? How you make money? How you can survive or live? Tell me more.
Definitely. So the company behind Rude Baguette is called Rude Media. We don't talk about it that much, but it's the parent company on top of it. And we're not as much focused on making money today as we are on solving a problem that we think is really big. And that is transparency, visibility, and access into non-Anglophone tech markets. So we announced last month that we'll be launching the Rude Pretzel next year, and that'll be an English language blog like the Rude Baguette, but covering the German tech market. And you can imagine a lot of the same benefits in Germany as we have in France today, providing visibility. More than 50% of our audience is the UK and the US, so providing that kind of transparency to those markets, to what's going on in Germany. But at the same time, you can also imagine that if we have you reading on the Rude Baguette an article about a mobile company in France, that we might recommend that you read about a mobile company in Germany. And suddenly you'll have French and German readers alike who will make up the bulk of our readership afterwards, who will not only be reading about their own country, but we will be slowly convincing them to read about their neighbors. And I think that the real opportunity isn't writing about one particular market in English. It's taking, say, Europe, which is 500 million people under one currency with one overarching legal structure, and saying, what if you have people in Sweden who know just as much about Berlin as they do about Spain? And what if you have people in the UK who know just as much about the UK as they do about France?
You got a point. You got a point.
And there, I think, is the real opportunity. There, I think, when you have companies in France who don't have an economical obligation to launch in the U.S.
Yes.
I mean, the reason you launch in the U.S. is because it's 300 million people under one legal structure, under one currency.
Exactly.
But in our own backyard, we have 500 million people. And what everyone says about Europe is it's fragmented. And it's fragmented by language. But what if you eliminate the language barrier?
You got a point.
So that's
the next step is
today.
Europe. Is Rude Baguette expanded in Europe?
Part of it is more news in more markets. We just announced also at Le Web this week that we'll be launching what we're going to call Rude List. And the idea is to answer the question, what is the best startup in France? And not necessarily best in terms of our favorite or the making the most money, but what are the ones that you need to pay attention to? And so what we did is we took all of our knowledge from all the 1,500 plus articles we've done in the last 2 years.
That's a lot.
And we dumped it into a database. And we've been doing this for quite some time, and we've been using it internally. And the idea is to track every founder, every entrepreneur, every startup, every investment.
So it's the last part of the interview. So it's time for our no taboo questions. So this is a paper teller with questions. So I'm going to ask you to give me a number between 1 to 5.
Okay. I'm going to go, I say think big, so 5.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Which color?
I'm going to go with red.
Red? So, what great idea did you have, but someone else beat you at it?
That's a tough one. Okay. Before I started the Rude Baguette, I participated in a startup weekend in Nantes, so that might tell you a bit about my previous relationship with Nantes. And we had an idea to do an events management platform, like a lot of people. And I can't necessarily say that someone has beaten us to it, but we ran into so many barriers that I thought so many people could conquer that we never did it. And the idea was to create a sort of ephemeral social network around an event. So you attend Le Web, like was happening here in Paris, and you could go on and maintain relationships with those people for a certain amount of time after the event. And I can't necessarily say that someone's beaten us to it, but we never got it done, and I'm sure someone's going to do it fantastically.
Okay, that's going to give us some idea for our listeners. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Good luck for the next venture in Europe, expanding.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
It was Aurelien Cottet with Liam Boogar for Straight from the US on Widoobiz.